Australia, 1932. A vast, sun-scorched landscape stretches across Western Australia. Wheat fields ripple in the heat. Farmers work the land, trying to recover from drought, economic collapse, and the aftershocks of war. They are already fighting to survive. But then, the enemy arrives. Not soldiers, not rebels, not bandits. Emus. Thousands of them, fast, massive, unstoppable. The farmers try to hold the line. They ask for help, and help arrives in the form of military. The soldiers of Australia are preparing to do what no one has ever attempted before, to defeat the emus. This is the story of a war Australia never meant to fight. The Great Emu War. Let's begin. The situation in Western Australia was already fragile. The Great Depression had left farmers stretched thin, debts piling up, harvests uncertain, and entire communities clinging to hope that the next season might finally bring relief. Then came the emus. After breeding inland, thousands of them began migrating toward the coast. It wasn't unusual at first. Australia's wildlife had always been unpredictable. But this was different. These were not scattered birds. These were coordinated flocks. They moved like tides across the wheat fields, stripping crops bare, snapping through fencing, and overwhelming anything in their path. The farmers tried everything they could think of: guards, repairs, makeshift barriers, even scare tactics. Nothing worked. So in desperation, the farmers turned to the government. They argued that this wasn't an agricultural nuisance anymore. It was a crisis threatening livelihoods, food supply, and regional stability. And the government listened. But instead of sending money, engineers, or long-term support, they sent soldiers. 2 men in particular were assigned to lead the operation, armed with machine guns, military discipline, and confidence in modern firepower. The mission seemed simple on paper. Locate the emu flocks, eliminate the threat, restore order. No one expected resistance. After all, they were just birds. But out in the wheat fields, something very different was waiting. Something that didn't behave like prey. Something that didn't panic under fire. Something that ran fast and didn't stop. The soldiers arrived in Western Australia in late 1932, confident and prepared. On paper, their plan was straightforward. Emus were large, visible, and crucially, supposedly easy targets for modern weaponry. The troops believed they would only need a few well-placed operations to bring the situation under control. Reality disagreed almost immediately. The first challenge wasn't finding emus. It was finding them where they stayed. The flocks didn't behave like predictable enemy formations. They scattered across a vast farmland, moving constantly, breaking into smaller groups whenever they sensed pressure. Instead of standing their ground, they vanished into the landscape, dust, scrub, and often field, swallowing them whole. And contact was finally made. It wasn't decisive battle. It was chaos. At first, a group of soldiers set up a position near a known grazing area, waiting for the birds to pass into range. Everything seemed under control. The emus appeared on the horizon, dozens of them moving in a loose formation, heads bobbing as they crossed fields. The order was given. Fire. But the moment the first shots rang out, something unexpected happened. The emus didn't panic. They split. The flock fractured into smaller groups, zigzagging unpredictably across the terrain. Their speed made them difficult targets, their movement irregular and almost impossible to track. What should have been a controlled engagement turned into a frantic scramble of missed shots and vanishing targets. Even worse, the terrain itself worked against the soldiers. Dust cloud kicked up by the birds obscured visibility. The heat shimmer distorted distance. Every advantage of the military planning began to dissolve in the Australian outback. When the firing finally stopped, very little had been achieved. A few emus had fallen, but the majority had escaped, still moving, still alive, still crossing the land as if nothing had changed. The soldiers regrouped, expecting this to be a minor setback, a correction in tactics. At first, attempt would be improved on, but they were beginning to realise, slowly and reluctantly, that this was not going to be a conventional operation. The enemy did not behave conventionally after all, and worse still, it seemed to be learning. By early November 1932, the operation had escalated. What had begun as a small military assistance effort was now a full attempt to contain and reduce the emu population spreading across Australian farmland. Commanders decided that if mobility and surprise had failed, then overwhelming firepower would succeed. So they adapted. A Lewis gun was mounted on a truck. The logic was simple. Instead of waiting for thieves to come into range, the military would take the fight to them. Mobile, fast, and decisive, a moving platform meant greater coverage, better positioning, and the ability to track flocks across open ground. At least that was the theory. In practice, the outback had other ideas. The rough terrain immediately turned the truck into an unstable weapon platform. Bumps and dips in the ground made accurate targeting nearly impossible. Every time the gunner tried to steady aim, the vehicle lurched, throwing off the shot. Then there were the emu's response. They did not bunch together. They did not slow down. They did not present themselves as an easy target. Instead, the flocks spread out even further, moving in irregular patterns that seemed almost coordinated, like they were anticipating where danger would come from. Some observers later noted that birds appeared to run alongside the truck's movement than away from it, forcing constant repositioning. The result was astonishing. Despite the firepower, despite the planning, despite the mobility, the effectiveness of the operation collapsed. The military expected precision. What they got was exhaustion. And then came the reports that made the situation even harder to explain. Some soldiers began to claim that hitting a single emu was unusually difficult, far more difficult than it should have been for such a large target. Others described flocks splitting at exactly the wrong moment, as if responding to the rhythm of the gunfire itself. The operation was not producing results. Back at headquarters, confidence began to erode. What was meant to be a swift resolution was turning into a prolonged and embarrassing struggle against an enemy no one had taken seriously. And still across the wheat fields of Australia, the emus kept moving. By late November 1932, the tone of the operation had changed completely. What had begun as a confident military response had become a slow, frustrating grind across the Western Australian wheat belt. The emus, meanwhile, showed no sign of stopping. They continued to appear in waves across farmland, sometimes in huge flocks, sometimes scattered into small groups that reformed just beyond the range of pursuit. Commanders began to reassess the situation. The idea of a quick, decisive campaign had clearly failed. Even with mounted weapons and coordinated attempts, the emus were proving too difficult to contain over such vast territory. The cost in time, effort, and ammunition was rising without a matching return in success. And then came the most uncomfortable conclusion of all. The operation was not working. News of the struggle began to spread beyond the field. Reports of ineffective engagements and limited success against rapidly moving flocks reached higher authorities, where the situation was viewed with growing concern, not just for practicality but for reputation. Eventually, the decision was made. The military presence would be scaled back. The operation, in effect, would be withdrawn. There was no grand announcement of victory, no final decisive engagement, no symbolic moment of closure. Just a quiet stepping away from a problem that refused to be solved by force alone. And as the soldiers left the wheat fields behind, the emus remained. Not defeated, not eradicated, not even particularly changed by the encounter. They continued to roam the farmlands they had before, indifferent to the idea that they had ever been at war at all. In the official record, the campaign would later be described in restrained terms. A difficult operation, an unconventional challenge, a situation that required a reconsideration. But in the folklore that followed, it became something else entirely. A war where one side was armed with modern weaponry, and the other side simply ran faster than history expected. The Great Emu War was over, and somehow the emus, in effect, had won. In the decades after 1932, the Great Emu War faded from official military discussion. It was not commemorated with monuments. There were no victory parades, no solemn remembrance days, no plaque marking key battles across the Western Australian wheat belt. Yet it never really disappeared. Instead, it became something far stranger. It became stronger. It became a symbol. At first, it survived quietly in historical summaries and regional storytelling, mentioned almost as an odd footnote in accounts of agricultural struggle during the Great Depression. A curious episode, an unusual attempt at pest control. Something historians could include in a paragraph to show just how harsh conditions had become. But as time passed, the story grew beyond its original context. In modern culture, the Emu War had become shorthand for unexpected failure in the face of underestimated opposition. A kind of historical irony, where confidence in technology collided with unpredictability and did not win. It began to appear in humour, especially in internet culture, where it found a second life as one of history's most surreal military defeats. The image of soldiers armed with machine guns being outmaneuvered by flightless birds became instantly recognisable, shared widely, and endlessly reinterpreted. But beneath the humour, something else persisted, a kind of fascination. Because the story touches on a deeper idea that resonates far beyond Australia. The assumption of control. Technology or planning always guarantees success, and the moments in history where that assumption breaks down quickly. The Emu War also entered classrooms and documentaries, usually framed carefully as historical curiosity rather than traditional conflict. It's often used to illustrate broader themes: human-environment interactions, pest management policy, and the unintended consequences of intervention. Even tourism has not entirely ignored it. In Western Australia, local storytelling and heritage discussion sometimes reference the event as part of regional identity. This is a shameful episode, and more of an odd, uniquely Australian moment where nature simply refused to cooperate with expectation. Over time, the emu itself became something of an unofficial symbol within the story, not as a conquering force in a literal sense, but as a reminder that systems, natural or otherwise, do not always behave as intended when confronted. And so the Great Emu War persists in modern culture as not a traditional war story, but as something stranger, a reminder wrapped in humour, a historical anomaly that refuses to be neatly categorised. And one of the few moments in history where the phrase, "the enemy advanced faster than expected," turned out to be surprisingly literal. And in the end, that is the story. A campaign born out of desperation, shaped by confidence, and remembered for its unpredictability. The Great Emu War sits in history's margins, not because it was the largest conflict, or the longest, or the most consequential in a traditional sense, because it reveals something unexpectedly universal, that control is never absolute, that planning meets reality on uneven ground, that sometimes the world does not respond the way we expect it to. Today, the wheat fields of Western Australia are quiet again. The fences have been rebuilt, the harvests have changed, and the emus, still present in the landscape, as they always have, unbothered by the stories told about them. And maybe that is the final irony. Not in a war that was fought and lost, but that nature never really noticed it was happening in the first place. Thank you for listening to History as a Story. Until next time, goodbye.